They say the dead speak to those whom the living have abandoned. The cemetery gates groaned under November's weight, their iron skin weeping rust. Margaret knelt between headstones worn smooth by decades of rain, her fingers sinking into soil that held more stories than any living voice could bear. 32 years old, and she had spent half her life in this place, not by choice, but by curse. Her father had been the gravedigger. Her mother, a midwife who delivered children into a world that would soon forget them. When fever took them both in the same autumn, Margaret inherited their profession. She prepared the dead for eternity. Her hands learned the language of death before they ever knew desire. Cold skin, stiffening joints, the weight of what remains when breath abandons the body. The village called her many things: gravedigger's daughter, the woman who dances with corpses, cursed. But the most damning name came from the priests, the one who cannot be touched by God's light because she touches his failures. Margaret didn't believe in curses then. She believed in work, in the precision of laying out the departed with dignity, in washing them clean, in braiding hair and closing eyes that had seen too much. Every body she prepared was a prayer her lips couldn't form. But 3 years ago, something changed. She had been preparing old Thomas Brennan, the blacksmith, when her hand brushed his chest. His heart, already still for hours, seemed to pulse beneath her palm. Not physically. Something else. A memory. A moment. She saw him at 19, standing in his father's forge, choosing between becoming a soldier or a craftsman. She felt the weight of that choice, the roads not taken, the life that crystallized into the body she was washing. Margaret gasped and pulled her hand away. Her own heart hammered as though she'd been the one touched by death. It happened again and again. With every corpse, with every careful touch, she received fragments, glimpses of their final thoughts, their deepest regrets, the moments that defined them. The baker's wife thinking of her daughter in America. The merchant remembering a kiss he'd stolen in his youth. The child born too soon, a consciousness barely kindled before it extinguished. The village noticed the change in Margaret. Her eyes grew distant. She spoke less, and when she did prepare the dead, something shifted in the room. A heaviness, as though grief itself had weight and texture. People began to avoid her. Then came the whispers about plague. It started in October, a fever that moved through the lower village like a predator. Within weeks, Margaret found herself preparing 3, 4, sometimes 5 bodies a day. The church closed its doors. Families turned their backs on the dying. And Margaret, the cursed gravedigger's daughter, became the only one willing to touch them. She was washing a young mother's hands when the carriage arrived. It was black lacquered wood, drawn by 4 horses the color of midnight. The man who descended wore a coat of burgundy velvet, and when he stepped into the graveyard, the autumn wind stopped entirely. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. He moved toward Margaret with a grace that wasn't quite human, and she knew, the way one knows certain truths without evidence, that he was something other than the living who had scorned her. "You," he said, his voice like candlelight made audible. "You see them when you touch them, don't you? You read the dead." Margaret's hands trembled. She didn't ask how he knew. The question that emerged instead was older, deeper. "Are you here to curse me further, or to end it?" The man knelt beside the body of the young mother. He placed his hand over Margaret's, and she felt it. Not death this time, but something far more terrible. An eternity of hands, an eternity of touching, an eternity of being alone with the knowledge of every soul that had ever chosen to leave this world. "I came," he said softly, "because I have been searching for someone like you for 500 years. Someone who understands that mercy and death are not opposites. Someone broken enough to recognize another broken thing." His eyes met hers, and in them she saw graves within graves. Coffins nested like Russian dolls, centuries of autumn rains and unplanted flowers. "My name is Adrian," he whispered, "and I believe your curse is the only thing that could save me." He raised her trembling hand to his lips and kissed it, a gesture both tender and apocalyptic, and the entire graveyard erupted with the sound of 1,000 souls breathing their last all at once. Margaret's scream became a prayer. The prayer became her first choice. Chapter 2. The Language of Thorns. The manor stood 3 miles beyond the village, hidden in forest so old it seemed to predate mercy. Margaret had walked willingly into Adrian's carriage, abandoning her cottage with nothing but the clothes she wore and the weight of every dead hand she'd ever touched still warm against her skin. She expected dungeons. Instead, she found a library. Thousands of books-lined walls that seemed to breathe. Candles burned with flames that cast no shadows. And everywhere, on tables, on shelves, pressed between pages, were roses. Dead roses. Dried roses. Roses in every stage of decay, each one preserved as though death were an art form. "I've been collecting them," Adrian said, watching her move through the room like a ghost, learning to haunt her own afterlife. "For 4 centuries. Each one marks a moment when I chose not to die, even though dying would have been merciful." Margaret picked up one of the roses, its petals the color of old wine. When her fingers closed around it, she didn't see Adrian's memory. She saw the rose's memory, a garden in 1387, a woman with eyes like storms, a hand reaching to pluck it. She saw the choice to cut something beautiful and watch it slowly refuse to live. "You're learning," Adrian said. "Your gift isn't about the dead. It's about the moment between life and death. It's about the breath where choice lives." "Why me?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "Because you were already half dead before I found you. The village had already buried you alive." He moved closer, and she could smell him now. Cedar wood, rain on stone, something metallic and old. His skin was cool, but his presence radiated a heat that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the heat of things that refused to extinguish. "I will not make you like me," Adrian continued, "unless you choose it. But I will teach you what I know. That immortality is not a reward. It is a decision made every single day. Every sunrise you choose to wake. Every mirror you choose to look. Every grave you could join, you choose to walk past." Margaret sank into a chair upholstered in black velvet. "The plague, the village, did you—" "No." His denial was sharp, final. "The plague is human cruelty, fever born from poverty and sin and the world's indifference. But I could have stopped it if I wanted to be a god. I didn't. I came for you instead." "Why? What am I to you?" Adrian knelt before her, not in supplication, but in witnessing. He took her hand carefully, as though it were made of glass. "You are the first person I've met in 5 centuries who understands that touching death doesn't corrupt you. It transforms you. Everyone else I've known has tried to escape their own mortality. You've been embracing it, teaching it kindness." He pressed his forehead against her hand, and Margaret felt it, the full weight of his centuries, not as memory, but as presence. 500 years of autumn nights, 500 years of choosing, 500 years of roses dying in his hands. She wept, not from fear, but from recognition. Over the following weeks, Adrian taught her the grammar of his existence, how to read the spaces between heartbeats, how to understand that time moves differently when you've watched empires crumble into dust, how to love something knowing that everything you love will perish except you. He showed her his collection, journals filled with the names of everyone he'd ever loved. Most of them were dead. Some had been dead for centuries. One name appeared repeatedly, scored through again and again, as though the act of erasure could undo the choice Adrian had made to watch her aging while he remained frozen in 1523, the year she'd begged him to let her go. "I could have turned her," Adrian whispered, tracing the scratched-out name with one pale finger. "I could have made her eternal. but I loved her enough to let her choose the one thing I cannot have: peace. Ending. The mercy of forgetting. Margaret understood then that Adrian's curse wasn't immortality. It was compassion that had calcified into a kind of beautiful agony. One night, as they walked through the manor's gardens where dead roses bloomed in moonlight, Margaret asked the question that had been growing in her throat like a flower. "Do you want me to die?" Adrian stopped walking. Around them, the night held its breath. "No," he said, "but I want you to understand that every moment with you is a moment I'm stealing from the grave. Every touch between us is choosing life when death would be easier. That's what immortality really is, not eternal youth or endless pleasure. It's the eternal weight of choosing not to surrender." He pulled her close, and she felt his heart. It beat. She was sure of it. Not from physiology, but from will. Adrian's heart beat because 500 years ago he had decided that love was worth the cost of everything. When he kissed her, Margaret tasted roses and rain and the particular sorrow of beautiful things that cannot die. Chapter 3. The Mirror of Thorns winter came early that year, and the manor became a tomb of ice and candlelight. Margaret had been with Adrian for 4 months when she found the mirror. It hung in a room she hadn't entered before, behind a door concealed in the library's eastern wall. The mirror was enormous, ornate silver frame twisted into thorns and roses, reflective surface so clear it seemed to show not just her image, but something deeper. Her soul, perhaps, or what remained of it after spending her life among the dead. Margaret looked at her reflection and barely recognized herself. Her skin had taken on a translucent quality, as though she were gradually becoming glass. Her eyes had darkened, and where they once held the exhaustion of the living, they now held the weight of observation. She was becoming something other. "That mirror has been with me for 300 years, Adrian said from the doorway. She hadn't heard him approach. It belonged to a woman in Prague who could see the future. She used it to watch the deaths she couldn't prevent. When she finally died, I took it as a reminder that seeing too much and changing nothing is its own form of damnation." "Am I changing?" Margaret turned from the mirror to face him. "You promised you wouldn't." "I haven't touched you with the intention to transform you," Adrian interrupted. "But love between the dead and the living always transforms both parties. You're becoming something new. The question is what you choose to become." He approached the mirror and stood beside her. In the reflection, he looked exactly as he must have looked in 1523, beautiful in the way dangerous things are beautiful, tragic in the way immortal things are tragic. But Margaret saw something else. She saw that he was also becoming something. In proximity to her humanity, his edges were softening. His immortality was developing cracks. "I'm dying?" Adrian asked, reading the revelation in her expression. "You're learning how to," Margaret replied, "through me, the way I'm learning how to live forever through you." Before Adrian could respond, the mirror's surface rippled. The image shifted, and they were no longer looking at their own reflections. They were looking at the village, at the graveyard where Margaret had spent her life, at the church where, even now, people were gathering to pray for the plague to end. And in the center of the graveyard stood a figure Margaret recognized, Father Matthias, the priest who had called her cursed. He was holding something, a wooden box filled with earth from her childhood grave, the one her parents shared. He was leading a procession, and people were coming from their homes, faces twisted in something between devotion and violence. "They're coming," Adrian whispered. "The village has decided that your absence means you've taken the plague with you. They're coming to consecrate the ground, to drive out the demon that wore your face." Margaret felt something crystallize inside her. Not fear. Something older. The recognition of inevitability. She had always known the village would turn on her. She had simply hoped to have more time before they did. "We could flee," Adrian offered, but his voice carried no conviction. They both knew fleeing would only delay the inevitable. Fear, once released in a village, grows like plague itself. "No," Margaret said quietly. "I'm not running from my own grave." She walked toward the door, but Adrian caught her wrist. His grip was gentle, but it held the force of 500 years of choices. "If you go back there, they will try to destroy you. They will call you witch, demon. They will use fire and prayer and all the weapons fear gives to the desperate." Margaret looked at him, really looked at him. She saw in his face the echoes of every love he'd watched die. She saw the particular agony of someone who had learned that immortality meant watching mortality devour everyone he cherished. "Then you'll have to choose," she said, "whether to let me die the way everyone else does, or whether to make me eternal. But Adrian, understand this. I won't ask you to do it. I won't beg. Because if you make me immortal, it has to be a choice made in love, not in desperation. It has to be an act of mercy, not of possession." Adrian's hand fell from her wrist. She saw the struggle in his face, the weight of 500 years of wrong choices, of turning lovers to save them only to watch them slowly resent the gift of eternity. "I need to think," he said finally. Margaret nodded and walked past him, back toward the library, back toward the room where dead roses bloomed in eternal suspension. She had hours before the village arrived, hours to prepare. She found paper and began to write her own eulogy. When the knock came at the manor's door, not a knock, but the sound of torches being set against wood, Adrian stood beside her at the threshold. He was in his formal clothes, the ones he wore in 1523, the ones he wore the night he chose to become what he was. "Whatever happens," he said, "know that you taught me something in these 4 months that 500 years couldn't. You taught me that death is not the enemy. Surrender is." The doors opened. The village poured in like a flood, torches casting the manor into apocalyptic shadow. Father Matthias led them. Holy water raised like a weapon. But when he saw Adrian standing beside Margaret, hand in hand, he stopped. "Leave her alone," Adrian said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries, "or I will show you what true darkness means." Father Matthias stepped forward, crucifix raised, prayers spilling from his mouth in desperate torrents. The village pressed closer, fear and faith mixing into something volatile and violent. Margaret squeezed Adrian's hand. She understood then that the moment of choice had arrived, not just for her, but for him. He could slaughter them all. He had the power. 500 years of strength against their fragile human frames. Instead, he lifted Margaret's hand to his lips and kissed it, just as he had in the graveyard, but this time in front of all of them. "I choose her," Adrian announced to the village, to the night, to God himself. "I choose her over eternity, over power, over the mercy of non-existence. This woman is not cursed, she is blessed, and if you touch her, I will ensure that you understand the difference between those two things." The village stood frozen. For a moment, fear and faith warred in their hearts. Then, slowly, they began to back away, not out of acceptance, but out of terror. They had come for a witch and found instead something worse, a creature willing to defend her. As the last villagers fled into the winter night, Adrian turned to Margaret. "I will give you a choice," he said, "true choice, not transformation, not eternity, but this. You can walk away. Take what I have, gold, a carriage, a destination far from here. Live as long as a human can, and leave me to my centuries. Or you can stay, and we will find a third path, something neither of us has discovered yet." Margaret looked at his face, beautiful and terrible and infinitely sad. She thought of the mirror, of dead roses, of 500 years of choosing. "I'll stay," she said, "but not because I want to be immortal, Because I want to teach you how to live with someone who understands that all beauty ends. That's not a curse, that's redemption. And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these immortal confessions travel, and at what moments of the night they find you. Chapter 4: The Anatomy of Eternity. Spring came the way spring comes to places touched by immortality, sudden, violent, almost obscene in its beauty. The manor's gardens exploded into life, and Margaret found herself learning the language of growth the way she had once learned the language of decay. Adrian had begun to change. It wasn't visible at first, just small things. He cast shadows now. His reflection in mirrors lasted longer before fading. He had begun to age, microscopically but measurably. 500 years of perfect stasis was unraveling, one breath at a time. "It's because I love you," Adrian explained one evening as they walked through gardens where living roses bloomed alongside dead ones. Immortality requires a certain kind of distance from emotion, a frost around the heart. But you melted that, and now I'm thawing. Now I'm becoming human again. "Is it painful?" Margaret asked. "Excruciating," he replied, not unkindly. "But I deserve it." Margaret had begun to understand Adrian's particular tragedy. He wasn't a villain who had been cursed with immortality as punishment. He was a man who had been offered the choice to save his dying love, and who had spent 5 centuries regretting that gift. Every soul he'd watched age, while he remained unchanged, was a weight he carried like stones in his chest. They found it in the manor's deepest room, a chamber Adrian had never shown her before. The walls were lined with journals, each one dated, each one filled with the same woman's name, written thousands of times, sometimes in love, sometimes in fury, sometimes in prayers that grew increasingly desperate over centuries. "Isabel," Adrian whispered, running his fingers over the spines. "She was married to me for 17 years before I offered her eternity. She refused. She said that living forever with me would mean forgetting how to live at all. So I let her age. I watched her become old. And then I wrote about her every day for the next 483 years. Margaret opened one of the journals at random. The entry was from 1743. Today, I tried to remember the exact shade of her eyes. I could not. After 200 years, I have forgotten the color of the only thing that made me human. I am becoming a fossil of myself, preserved in amber and regret." "Why did you never turn another?" Margaret asked. "Find someone else to make eternal?" "Because I realized," Adrian said slowly, "that the gift of eternity isn't a gift at all. It's a theft. It steals from someone the one mercy that every living thing deserves, the knowledge that their story will end, that their pain is temporary, that they will eventually rest." They stood in silence among centuries of journals. Margaret understood then that Adrian hadn't been alone these 500 years. He had been with Isabel, every day through the medium of memory and regret. "I want to show you something," Margaret said finally. She took Adrian's hand and led him upstairs to the room with the mirror. In the glass, she showed him his own reflection, clearer now, more human. She took his face in her hands and made him look at what he was becoming. "You're not dying," she said. "You're remembering. And that's not a curse either. That's the beginning of redemption." Adrian pulled away from her gaze. "I don't deserve redemption. I took Isabel's choice away from her when I offered eternity. Every century since, I've been trying to write my way back to innocence, but you can't. You can only carry the weight and hope that eventually someone sees the weight and loves you anyway." "I see it," Margaret said. "I see it, and I love you anyway." Over the following weeks, Adrian began to train Margaret in the other aspects of immortality, not the gift of eternal life, but the burden of eternal consciousness. How to hold centuries of memory without going mad. How to watch cultures rise and fall without becoming nihilistic. how to love fiercely knowing that love will always end. Every century, Adrian explained, you must choose to remember correctly, not to beautify, not to rewrite, but to hold the truth of what was, even when the truth is that you failed someone you loved. They began a ritual. Every full moon, they would sit in the room with Adrian's journals, and he would read passages to Margaret. She would listen without judgment, without offering comfort. She would simply bear witness to his truth. One night, Adrian opened a journal from 1612 and froze. There, written in a different hand, different ink, was a letter. It was dated 5 years after Isabel's death, and it was addressed to Adrian. The letter was from Isabel's daughter, Adrian's daughter, a child he hadn't known existed, born 3 years after he had watched his beloved age and die. The letter contained a single line, repeated hundreds of times, "Forgive him." Adrian wept for the first time in 500 years. The tears were not water, but something heavier, something that had been crystallized by centuries of immortal solitude. Margaret held him, and in holding him, felt the weight of all the love he had carried alone. "I think," Adrian whispered into her shoulder, "that Isabel knew. I think she knew what I would become, and she forgave me anyway. That's why she wouldn't let me turn her. She was protecting me from myself." Margaret didn't speak. She simply held him, a vampire becoming human again through the alchemy of grief and recognition. As the night deepened, Adrian made a decision. He took Margaret to the room where he kept Isabel's possessions: a wedding ring, a letter, a dried flower from her wedding bouquet, and he placed them all in Margaret's hands. "These aren't mine to carry anymore," he said. "I've been holding them so tightly that they've become monuments instead of memories. I want to give them to you, not to replace her, but to share her, to transform her from my eternal regret into something we both hold with gentleness." Margaret accepted the objects with the reverence they deserved, and in that moment she understood that the true nature of immortality wasn't the refusal to die. It was the ability to mourn over and over without being destroyed by mourning. Chapter 5. The Weight of Mortality. Summer arrived with a particular cruelty. Adrian's aging accelerated, not visibly to anyone but Margaret, who had learned to read the language of bodies the way she had once read the language of corpses. His hair began to gray at the temples. His hands developed age spots. His movements, once liquid grace, became careful, deliberate. "It's happening faster than I expected," Adrian said one morning, studying his reflection with a kind of clinical detachment. "When I was with Isabel, aging would have taken decades. With you, it seems to be condensing, as though the normal rules of time no longer apply." Margaret realized then that they were caught in a kind of inverse alchemy. Adrian was becoming mortal at an accelerated pace, burning through 500 years of preserved youth in a matter of months. And she was becoming something other, something that could perceive the accelerated decay around her without flinching. "Do you regret it?" she asked, "choosing me over eternity?" Adrian considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Every day," he said finally, "and I would make the same choice again, without hesitation. That's the paradox of redemption. It always involves choosing the thing that destroys you, because you love it more than you love yourself." As summer deepened, Adrian began to prepare for his own death. He showed Margaret the rituals of his kind, not religious ceremonies, but practical preparations. He introduced her to the vampire court that existed in the shadows of European society, ancient beings who watched Adrian's descent with a mixture of contempt and fascination. "He's choosing mortality," they whispered, "for a human woman, for a gravedigger's daughter." One of the elders, a woman named Leonora, who had been turned in 1247, approached Margaret directly. "You understand what you're doing?" Leonora asked. Her voice was like wind across ancient tombs. "You're not just killing him, you're erasing 5 centuries of accumulated power. You're removing a creature who could have shaped nations. All for what? A few decades of companionship?" "Yes," Margaret said simply. "That's exactly what I'm doing." Leonora studied her with eyes that had watched empires crumble. "Then you're not a human at all. You're something far more dangerous. You're someone who understands that immortality without end is just another word for imprisonment. I almost like you." As Adrian's mortality accelerated, Margaret found herself becoming the caretaker. She learned medicine not from books, but from Adrian himself, who had gathered 500 years of knowledge about the human body. She learned how to ease pain, how to comfort, how to sit with someone as they transformed into something fragile. The roses died. Adrian stopped collecting them. Instead, he began writing letters, not to Margaret, but to Isabel. Letters that Margaret would deliver to Isabel's grave after he was gone. "Tell her," Adrian instructed, "that I finally understand why she refused eternity. It wasn't because she didn't love me. It was because she loved me enough to want me to experience what every living thing deserves, the knowledge that everything ends, and that's what makes everything precious." One night, as autumn approached and Adrian's aging had become visible even to casual observers, he took Margaret to the mirror one final time. "Look," he said, standing beside her. Their reflections were almost identical now. 2 beings caught between life and death, between human and other. "This is what I see when I look at you. I see someone who has already spent her life half dead, preparing other people's endings. And I see myself, finally learning how to live by learning how to die." Adrian's hands were skeletal now, marked with the brown spots of age. His hair had turned entirely white. His eyes, however, held the clarity of someone who had finally made peace with their own ending. "I want to tell you something," Adrian said, his voice thin but steady, "that I couldn't tell Isabel because I didn't understand it myself. Immortality is a disease that masquerades as a blessing. The cure isn't death. The cure is love. Love that makes you mortal. Love that teaches you that impermanence is the source of all meaning." Margaret held his hand, this hand that had held dead roses for 4 centuries, that had reached for Isabel across the void of her aging, that had touched Margaret's face the night he chose her over eternity. "I love you," she whispered. "I know," Adrian replied, "and that's the only thing that's ever mattered." Chapter 6. The Breaking Point. Autumn came, and with it, the season of endings. Adrian was dying now, truly dying, not as an abstract concept, but as immediate, inescapable reality. His body was consuming itself, 500 years of preserved immortality burning away like a star collapsing inward. The village, having learned of Adrian's condition, began to gather at the manor's gates. Not with torches this time, but with something more terrible: hope. They believed that God was finally punishing the vampire, finally reclaiming the natural order that Margaret and Adrian had disrupted. Father Matthias came to the manor's threshold, and this time Adrian let him enter. "I've come to offer last rites," the priest said, though his eyes betrayed that he hoped for refusal, for some sign of demonic resistance that would confirm his theology. Adrian was sitting in a chair by the window, so thin now that he seemed to be dissolving into the light. But he smiled at the priest with a kindness that unnerved him. "Yes," Adrian said. "Please, I would like that very much." As Father Matthias performed the ceremonies, Margaret stood apart, watching. She realized that Adrian was not receiving the rites out of conversion, but out of mercy. He was giving the priest something to believe in at the end, a narrative that would allow the village to understand his death as redemption rather than tragedy. "Forgive me, Father, for I have loved well," Adrian whispered during the confession. And the priest's hands trembled as he offered absolution that neither of them believed in, but both understood as necessary. When the priest left, Adrian turned to Margaret. "I'm going to ask you to do something impossible," he said. "After I die, and I'm dying soon now, perhaps tonight or tomorrow, I want you to take my journals to the village. I want them to read the truth about who I was and what I chose to become." "They'll burn them," Margaret said. "They'll use them as evidence of your corruption." "Let them," Adrian replied. "But some will read them first, some will understand, and that's enough." That night, as Adrian's breathing became shallow and irregular, Margaret sat beside his bed and waited. She had spent 32 years preparing the dead. She knew what the body looked like as it approached its end. The slight coolness, the gradual dimming of the light in the eyes, the way breath became precious. But this was different. Adrian was not fading. He was transforming. As he died, something luminous filled the room. Not supernatural, but the simple luminescence of a life fully lived, fully examined, finally released. "Margaret," Adrian whispered, his voice barely audible, "thank you for teaching me that eternity isn't a destination. It's a moment, one moment, stretched infinite by love." She held his hand as he died, really died, not the pale imitation of immortal stasis, but true death, and felt the exact moment when his consciousness withdrew from his body. It wasn't like the other deaths she had prepared for. This one didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a threshold being crossed toward something vast and unknowable. For 3 days, Margaret kept his body in the manor. She washed it, braided his hair, dressed him in the burgundy velvet coat he loved. She performed every rite of the gravedigger, and as she worked, she felt connected to her father, to her mother, to every person who had ever understood that preparation of the dead was a sacred act. When she brought Adrian's journals to the village, they reacted exactly as she had predicted. Father Matthias declared them heresy. The councils debated whether to burn them. But Margaret had been strategic. She had given copies to the apothecary's daughter, to the baker's son, to 3 women who had lost children to plague. She had seeded them throughout the village like flowers that would bloom slowly over time, changing minds with the patience of perennial growth. The official journal, the one Adrian had kept for 500 years, she placed in the graveyard at the foot of his grave. She buried it there with her own addition. A letter describing exactly who Adrian had been and why he had chosen to become human again. As she threw the first handful of earth onto Adrian's coffin, Margaret realized something profound. She was no longer the cursed gravedigger's daughter. She was something new. She was a woman who had loved someone impossible, and in loving him, had learned that impossibility was just another word for transformation. If this story has already captured you, leave a like. It helps the voices of those who chose eternity reach more hearts. Chapter 7. The Resurrection of Choice. Winter came, and with it, the crystallization of everything that had happened. Margaret remained in the manor, tending Adrian's grave the way she had once tended her parents. But she was not alone. The village began to come to her, not with torches or prayers, but with their dead. They came because word had spread. The gravedigger's daughter did something others couldn't. When she prepared a body, she didn't just make it look peaceful. She somehow made it look understood, as though the person who lay in death had finally been seen, really seen, in a way they never had been in life. Margaret realized that Adrian's gift had remained with her even after his death. When she touched the dead, she still felt their final moments, their greatest regrets, their deepest loves. But now she knew what to do with that knowledge. She could tell families what their loved ones had been thinking at the end. She could provide closure through the language of truth rather than the language of comfort. The village, gradually, began to revise their understanding of what Margaret was. She was no longer cursed. She was blessed. She was a woman who had learned to speak the language of the dead and could translate that language into peace for the living. One night, Margaret was preparing the body of an old woman, the baker's wife who had died peacefully in her sleep, when she felt something shift in the room. The woman's daughter stood in the doorway, watching. "My mother spoke about you before she died," the daughter said. "She said you were the only person in this village who had ever truly listened to her. She said that every person she knew had spent their whole life talking to her without ever hearing her. But you somehow heard her, even though you never spoke to her in life." Margaret understood then that Adrian's death had not been an ending. It had been a transformation. His choice to become mortal, to love her, to die, it had rippled outward and changed the village. It had taught them that redemption was possible, that the impossible could be chosen, that mercy was more powerful than judgment. In the spring, almost a year after Adrian's death, Margaret found something extraordinary. A letter sealed in Adrian's hand, hidden in the mirror's frame. She must have missed it in her grief. Or perhaps Adrian had placed it there only after his death through some final act of impossible magic. The letter contained a single revelation. Adrian had not been the first to choose mortality for love. His own maker, the vampire who had turned him in 1523, had made the same choice centuries before, had become human again, and had left Adrian a choice: to become a demon who killed for sustenance, or to become something new. Adrian had chosen the latter. He had discovered how to feed on life force without killing, how to exist in the shadows without becoming evil. And now, the letter explained, Adrian was passing that choice to Margaret. She could leave the manor. She could become fully human and age naturally, finally experiencing the mercy of an ending. Or she could stay and discover what Adrian had discovered, that there was a third way, a path between mortality and immortality, a way to be both fully alive and fully conscious of death. Margaret read the letter 3 times, letting each word settle into her bones like stones finding their place in a riverbed. She thought of her parents, of the plague, of the village that had condemned her. She thought of Adrian's 500 years of solitude and his final transformative months of love. And then she walked into the garden, to the place where the living roses and dead roses grew intertwined, and made her choice. She chose to stay, not as a vampire, not as a human, but as something Adrian had become before her, a being who lived between the worlds, who could touch both the living and the dead, who understood that love was redemption, and redemption was the only true immortality. Chapter 8. The Eternal Threshold. 7 years passed. The village changed. The plague did not return. The crops grew abundant. And slowly, subtly, a new understanding took root in the soil where fear and hatred had once grown. The change came from small conversations between parents and children, from the apothecary's daughter quietly discussing Adrian's journals, from the baker's son sharing passages from those texts with travelers passing through. Margaret became a different kind of legend, not cursed but wise, not a witch but a healer. She prepared the dead as she always had, but now the living came to her as well. They came for counsel about love, about loss, about the choices that define a life, and she listened with the gravity of someone who had learned that all human pain was sacred because all human pain was temporary. On the anniversary of Adrian's death, Margaret stood at his grave as she did every year. But this year, she was not alone. A young man stood beside her, 17 years old, pale-skinned, with the particular beauty of those caught between life and death. "My name is Thomas," the young man said, "and Adrian was my grandfather. He left me a letter to be opened when I turned 17. It told me that if I wanted, I could find you, that you might teach me the third way, that you might help me understand how to be both human and other." Margaret looked at him and saw Adrian in his eyes, the same weight of impossible knowledge, the same terrible grace. And she understood that Adrian had made a choice even before he chose mortality. He had ensured that the line of compassionate immortality would continue, would be carried forward by those who chose love over power. "Tell me about your grandfather," Margaret said, taking the young man's hand and leading him to Adrian's grave. As they stood together over the earth that held Adrian's bones, Thomas told her the story he had been told, a story of 500 years compressed into 500 words, a story of choices, of redemption, of a vampire who became human because he learned that the only true eternity was love. When Thomas finished speaking, Margaret knelt and placed her hand on the grave. She felt Adrian still in a way that transcended death, not haunting but present, a consciousness woven into the earth itself, available to those who knew how to listen. He was a good man, Margaret told Thomas. Not a perfect one, not a redeemed one. Redemption isn't something you achieve, it's something you choose every moment. But he was a man who understood that the greatest power lies in surrendering power, that the truest immortality lies in accepting mortality, that love is the only revolution worth dying for. They stood together in the graveyard as dusk fell, and in the gathering darkness, Thomas asked the question that mattered most. Will you teach me? Margaret thought of Adrian's hands, of dead roses, of mirrors that showed truth instead of reflection. She thought of her parents, of the gravedigger's daughter who had touched death so often that death had finally touched her back, not as curse, but as recognition. Yes, she said, but understand this first. I won't teach you how to live forever. I'll teach you how to live so fully, so completely, so aware of the temporary nature of everything you love, that forever and an instant become the same thing. Thomas nodded, and together they walked back toward the manor, toward the rooms filled with roses and journals, toward a future that neither of them could predict, but both of them could choose. That night, Margaret opened Adrian's final journal to the last page. There, in handwriting that had grown shakier as Adrian's death approached, were words meant only for her. If you're reading this, I'm gone. But I want you to know that in my final months, I understood something I never could have grasped in all my centuries. That immortality isn't a blessing or a curse. It's a choice. An endless series of choices. And the greatest choice I ever made was choosing you. Not for eternity, just for now. Just for one perfect crystalline moment that stretched infinite because we both understood it was ending. Teach Thomas what I learned too late. That love isn't about defying death. Love is about embracing it. Love is about standing on the threshold between life and death and choosing every single day to step forward into the unknown. That's not immortality. That's resurrection. And it's far more powerful than any vampire's dream. I love you across all the thresholds between us. Adrian Margaret closed the journal and looked out the window toward the graveyard, where Adrian's grave was marked with a rose carved in stone, neither alive nor dead, but existing in the eternal moment between. She understood then that the story wasn't over. It was only beginning. And she, the gravedigger's daughter, who had spent her life preparing others for endings, would spend her eternal moments helping others understand that every ending was also a threshold, and that standing on that threshold with love was the only immortality that mattered. Subscribe if you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned. Comment eternal if you'd trade your soul for love that heals, like if you believe even monsters deserve a second chance. Follow for more immortal confessions born from blood and mercy.